Hello, my name is Jessica Geiger, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. The Dole Student Advisory Board is comprised of KU students committed to the bipartisan mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive many great opportunities. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. We would like to encourage each of you to get special benefits and support from the Dole Institute by becoming a friend of the Dole Institute. If you enjoy this evening's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Hearing assistance is available, and we have a loop seating section at each program designated by a sign. If you have any questions about the loop, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers. Before we begin tonight, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience member questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student helper will bring a microphone to you. Please stand, and if you are able, just ask one brief question. And now, please welcome Senior Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Jessica. Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics for the Journalism and Politics lecture, The Evolution of TV News. Tonight's panel discussion will be moderated by Bill Lacey, Director of the Institute. We are pleased to host Ed Hersh and Michael Cascio. Ed Hersh is a media executive and strategist who served as a Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning for the cable network Destination Discovery. He spent 16 years working at ABC News in a variety of senior production and programming positions. Michael Cascio is the recipient of 4 Emmy Awards, 2 Oscar nominations, and a Producer of the Year award. He's most recognized for his work at A&E, supervising the award-winning biography series, as well as investigative reports, City Confidential, and documentaries such as Titanic, Death of a Dream. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me this evening in welcoming Ed Hersh and Michael Cascio.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. Michael and Ed, let's start with getting a little bit of personal information on both of you beyond what Barbara just covered in her introduction. Let's have both of you describe your upbringing, education, and how you got interested and involved in television.
Interesting. We watch the news every night, and after a while, I became addicted to the people who were delivering the news as well as the news, and I thought, oh, that would be kind of a cool thing to do. But the two jobs that kind of shaped me were, one, I was a backstage janitor at a theater right outside of Washington called Wolf Trap, which was sort of like Tanglewood or one of the, and so therefore I was cleaning up for the stars, and you immediately find out that you know, show business, that's showbiz, you know, is cleaning the trash for the stars and for the patrons, and also you learn how to bag garbage and put garbage cans, and so it was actually good training for real life. And the other was the other summers that I had job, I was a clerk at the CIA. And as a clerk, I was, my dad worked at the CIA, and they always hired the kids of the people who worked there because we were already cleared for security. And the first days I was there, I went in with my dad, and I show my badge, and I look and I say, hey, Dad, that's Mr. Parsons. I thought he worked at the National Science Foundation. Oh, there's our neighbor, Mr. Schaefer. I thought he worked at the Pentagon. Oh, there's so-and-so. I thought they worked at the State Department. Well, they all worked at the CIA, and they'd all kept a secret. And they were all like, hi, hi, hi. And I learned, you know, how the government works or doesn't work. And I was put into the covert action staff, which sent agents all around the world. And then one day they said, here's a list of names, and I want you to pull them from the file, because it was a card file. We didn't have the computerization yet, and put this in the bag, the burn bag, which is that all these things were going to get burned. And after a while, I was like, what am I doing? They said, well, you're taking out the agents who have been outed in a magazine article, and we're disavowing our knowledge of them. So the reason I say that these were twin things is that I learned, that the CIA, a lot of smart people, was kind of boring. Backstage was like, not everything's cracked up. I ended up going into journalism and news because I thought you get to run around all day, you get to go to different stories, you get to touch, you get to do different things, and it's not boring. It's not sitting in an office all day, and so the rest is history.
I grew up outside of New York in Westchester County, and I was always interested in. It's funny, is there a single event? Two things. It's going to sound really silly. I saw the movie. I was supposed to have been in 6th grade for both of these things. I saw the movie A Hard Day's Night, and not only did I love the movie A Hard Day's Night, but there's a moment in A Hard Day's Night, a scene in it, where they're rehearsing for a TV special. That's what it's leading up to, and they're in a control room, and there's a director, and he's this, hateful guy in the movie. But he's directing, he's imperious, and he's telling them what to do. And they're on the monitors, and he's changing cameras, and they're directing the show. And that was a moment. I'm quite serious. It was like, I would love to do that. That's what I would love to do. And I think about that all the time. Well, I'll tell you in a moment. But then, and the second thing was, in my school, my elementary school got a grant, and this will date me, to put a television, educational TV little studio in the school. And they got a state grant to do that. And so directly across from my 6th grade classroom, they're installing all this camera equipment, and I'm watching them do it, and I'm seeing the monitors, and I'm going, this is the coolest thing. I really do want to do this. And so I was always interested. That really captivated me on how television worked, and its power, and its importance. And I have to tell you, I try not to take too many things for granted. And I was in the middle of, when I was at ABC News, I worked, my career just, Bill asked about my education. I went to Syracuse University's Newhouse School, undergraduate in journalism. I then went to the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where I was very blessed to have worked with the late Fred Friendly, who some of you may know as Edward R. Murrow's producer. He was at that point retired and head of CBS and head of the department, and was a great teacher, and what a lesson. So years later, I got thrust into producing. When Princess Diana was in an accident, I was the closest to the ABC studio of their senior producers. And I got there, and I'm standing there in the control room, and all these monitors are lit up, and oh my God, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, this is like A Hard Day's Night. And I said, I have gotten to do what I thought I would never get to do when I was in 6th grade. So, so it's kind of nice. But the thing about journalism, I do think is interesting, is it lets you it lets you be curious all the time. It lets you find out new things. There's not a day that goes by when you don't learn something new. Either how to do something, how to practice your craft, or learn something new about something. Being a general assignment producer or reporter, somebody says, you walk in the morning, somebody says, there's a big zoning controversy in place X, go cover it. Well, you got to educate yourself on it, and so it's still exciting, and I still love doing it.
One of the challenges of our program tonight is going to be that all of us who are basically my age and older are going to know what TV news used to be like, but we have quite a few young people here who may have studied the history, but obviously have not lived through it. But let's go back to the 60s and 70s, and I'd like both of you to comment about what the news was like back then when there were 3 networks and PBS.
Yeah, I mean, It's hard to imagine if you're under 40, you know, that if you think of it now on your ABC, CBS, and NBC station, there's news, likely, right? And there's local news and network news. And for America, that was it. That's it. There was three. You had your choice. And you know, I think you were either, I remember at the time, either an NBC family or a CBS family, or later ABC came along, and that was it for TV news. It's hard to imagine you didn't have choices. Eddie will go into that in a minute, because he's, but the interesting thing is you also probably had two newspapers coming into the house.
Exactly.
You had the morning paper and the evening paper, or maybe just one. But it was also part of the ritual. And I bring that up because I think when we get into it, I think the demise of newspapers is a shame, you know, basically in terms of journalism. But just curious, who here still gets a newspaper, a daily newspaper, on like an actual physical newspaper? It's pretty good. It's pretty good.
As noted in that bio, I'm on the adjunct graduate faculty at the Newhouse School now, and as Bill says, trying to explain this, not because people under the age of 40 or 30 don't want to know, but the context is really difficult, right? So the best way I can explain it, those of you who are students, raise your hand in the back. Yeah, we got a bunch in the back. Great. So here's the deal. Imagine you lived in a town, okay, that only had 3 restaurants, okay, and they only served food between 5 and 8 p.m., all right? You would get used to that, right? This one has Chinese food, this one has Italian food, this one has comfort food. You know what they like, what's good, you know what's bad, and that's your choice. So if you want to go out to dinner, you go there, or you drive to another town maybe. Now imagine, that's the world we lived in then. The world we live in now is a 24/7 food court that serves every type of food to every taste all the time. And so think about what that means. That means that the pie is divided up, I guess literally, the pie is divided up in the tiniest slices, right? How does somebody serving Southern Thai food make money, make money at that food court? It's got to stay open 24/7. So the world we live in of news, right? Endless sources, endless, not so much endless sources, endless platforms, endless niches, right? If you're left of center, there are a zillion sources. If you're right of center, there are a zillion other sources, right? And it's become so personalized and niched out, right? How do those make money? And that's what the challenge is. Not challenges that people aren't interested in news. How do you create a business model where where enough people are interested in the kind of news you serve? So that's why you've seen so much of this niching out. Let me ask the students in the back also. How many of you students own a TV? Yeah, a couple. Okay. How many of you subscribe to cable? Zero. Yeah. Okay. How many of you watch Netflix? Get most of your content from Netflix. There you go. How many of you are paying for Netflix or using your parents or roommates? A couple people are paying for Netflix. So much of this is I'll just end with saying this. So much of this is a weird, and I usually have like a PowerPointy thing that I show, but there is a weird amalgam of a combination in constant orbit, like three-dimensional chess, of the changing audience, the changing technology, and the changing business model. Because think about how those all spin around each other. The audience, the new technology comes out, I can watch news on my phone. The audience expects it. You now expect to watch whatever you want, whenever you want it. And then how do you make money at it so that you can do it more? So that is really what is in constant change in an unprecedented way.
And I think the system is was created almost as an accident of technology, that there was limited bandwidth for your television, right? There was 13 or 12 channels, 2 through 13. UHF really hadn't really come in, the VHF spectrum. And so, and because of overlapping signals, you could only have 3 or 4 or maybe 5 stations in a market, but really it was 2 or 3 from say like 1945 or 46 through the 70s into the 80s. That was the system, and that's the that's the thing where everybody sat down to one newscast, because that's really, as you say, those were all the choices. But it was almost an accident of technology that that enabled that. Plus, there were rules that the stations had to serve the public interest and the public necessity. So they created news departments, and they did interviews and stuff. And that was just because
they didn't have to make money.
Right. Well, they had to make. They were making money hand over fist, but they also wanted to keep their license, so they would do these programs. And then after a while, they made money. Yeah. And they said, hey, wait, we can make money. But it was interesting because it's an accident of technology, much like the system today that we have, which is all over the place, is not an accident, is a product of all of the technology that enables this massive choice. It's just overwhelming choices. You ever tried to go to Netflix and you're like, I could spend an hour and a half looking for something to do, to find. Anyway.
Bill, just to follow on one point, and you talk about the impact of those three, of having those 3 networks, right? That was because that's what was there, right? And now we live in this incredible age of personalization, which is you have a Spotify playlist, you have your Twitter feed that has, or Facebook feed, that has pre-selected places you're going to get your news. The idea of a mass appeal, thing, it's like, it's almost, today it feels almost anachronistic. And that, so part of it is, as I said, the technology, part of it is the ability to get all this stuff, and part of it is that we're in this age of personalization where you don't want to watch somebody else's news. You just want to watch your news, right, that you pre-selected.
Gentlemen, speak to the influence that anchors had in the 60s and 70s compared to the influence that they have now, and specifically, and Michael, I'll start with you, but specifically address the episode of Walter Cronkite, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and any other examples of that.
You all know that Walter Cronkite was the anchor at CBS, and he was thought to be the dean of anchors, and if Walter Cronkite said something, then it was then it must be news, and he was the most trusted man in America. I'm going to tell one story, Eddie will tell another. One is relevant to today because the impeachment hearing started today, and people think, oh, depending on which side you're on, you go, this is not a big story, this is a big story, this is a bunch of crap, this is, depending on how you look at it. Well, back when Watergate happened, there was the Watergate burglary, and it was a big story within Washington, and I was a student, and but outside of Washington, it really wasn't resonating. It was not, they do these surveys just like now. I don't know that, the average person in Kansas really cares that much about Ukraine. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But it's not at the top of mind, and Watergate was not at the top of mind either. And then one night in late October of 72, 73, Walter Cronkite decided to devote 15 minutes of his newscast. Now, the newscast is 30 minutes, but it's really only like 22 or 23 minutes. So basically 15 minutes of 22 minutes was devoted to explaining what all this Watergate fuss was about. And now when you only have 3 networks, there's one network that's devoting most of its newscast with Walter Cronkite, who was sort of like God on Mount Olympus, telling you that this is important. And until that time, the rest of America really hadn't, it was out there, but they really hadn't focused on it. And it is credited to this day, you can look it up, to making the public aware of something that they hadn't been aware of before, maybe for good reason, maybe it hadn't developed. And then later, after that, it it took on more importance after Nixon won the election. And I bring that up because today, you know, the impeachment hearings start, but there's no Walter Cronkite. There's nobody that's going to say this is important or this isn't important. You may get all different sides saying it. There's not going to be one source that determines that. And it was so different back then that when that happened, I was actually in New York at the time. Our graduate class was going to different networks, and I was at the CBS rival, which was NBC, and John Chancellor or David Brinkley or somebody. And we were watching the competitive news. We spent the day with the news, and at NBC, they didn't do that story. That Watergate was not the big story. They go to CBS, and we watch the CBS News, their rival, and everybody's like, what? Walter Cronkite is spending 15 minutes doing what? And I asked the guy, the head guy, I can't remember his name now, head of NBC News, I said, how do you feel about this? He's doing this big thing, and you guys are doing, bupkis. And he said, I can hear the dials of America turning off. That they're bored by this Watergate stuff, and they don't really want to hear it. And I just know the rest of the country doesn't really care. And he was wrong.
He was wrong.
Yeah.
Bill mentioned when we were talking before this that there's another incident of that, and I think it's the one you were thinking about in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, right? That there was, obviously growing sentiment in the late '60s that this was not going to be winnable and that things were going the wrong way. And again, unusually, Walter Cronkite, the sort of the gatekeeper of to Middle America, went to Vietnam and did a report during the Tet Offensive, and he concluded that literally that there's no way. Based on this reporter, and he never gave his opinion. That was the thing about Cronkite. And he actually said, based on this reporter's, I can still remember him saying it, this reporter's point of view or this reporter's work, there does not seem to be a path to victory. And President Johnson was later quoted as saying to his staff, well, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost the country. Now, to your point, I want to answer, though, your point. I'm not sure that there's another Cronkite, but you actually have heard in the White House, if I've lost Sean Hannity, I've lost my base. And if I've lost Rachel Maddow, we've lost. So those people exist, but in this polarized world, in this factionalized and fractionalized world, there are still some of those iconic anchors. They don't wield the mainstream power, just like there's no one Ed Sullivan show, for those of you of a certain age anymore, that sort of dominates the airways, or one Johnny Carson that dominates the late night. But there are still people who have, you guys in the back would think of them as influencers, right? And they are. And they were the influencers with a huge mass audience at the time.
Yeah. Okay. Now, how was network news different back then? Is it fair to say that they were more an arbiter of facts and more interested in issues, or is that not fair to say?
Yeah, I recently had a conversation with somebody about this. Here's, again, I don't mean to be the well, just look at your phone guy, but think about, again, how this ecosystem has changed, right? You looked at that, you got the morning paper, and then the next time, unless you listen to news radio or something like that, the next time you got news was at 6:30. So their job was to try to tell you everything that happened in some certain order of importance every day. And that was the challenge. I know when I worked on the evening news, we took seriously. Even in local news, that's what they took seriously. Well, think about it now. You got your phone, you got your desktop computer, right? By the time you get to 6:30, you know a lot of what you think happened. So the job, if you watch the evening news now, which doesn't have the importance or the ratings, although it still has 20 or 30 million people watching every night. So let's not have a funeral procession yet for the evening news. But it still has a large audience. But it has a different job. Because when you get tweets all day long, car bomb in Afghanistan, school shooting in such and such a place, you know now that that happened almost immediately. What you don't know is why it happened and what it means. So if you watch the first 15, 20 minutes of the evening newscast, they're still pretty hard news, and they're still trying to tell you a little bit more about what's most important and what it means. Now, what they also do is local news and evening news spend a fair amount of time showing you the viral video, a car chase in California, and you won't believe what happened next.
Well, 'twas ever thus, though. I remember the water skiing dog. We're always running that piece. But the interesting thing is that news has become, because of that, the news has become more opinion. It's like such and such happened. Let me turn to my panel. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I want to know what actually. I want to know more fact. And I'm just getting old. I'm like, yeah, I could look it up, or I could wait till tomorrow and read it. But they're immediately going to analysis, or the water skiing dog, or the update. That's why I think those evening news programs are still serve a function for me. I don't know about you, but they are based on fact, and I find that the news networks, because it's cheaper. There's the secret. It's a lot cheaper to have a bunch of people sitting around talking about the news than it is to actually go out and report the news. And frankly, it's a lot easier because they say, okay, such and such happened, let's talk about it. And I'm like, well, why don't you tell me more about what happened, and that's my beef with it, and probably speaks to your question, which is, I think that somewhere along the line, facts became a commodity instead of something precious. And facts, they matter, of course they matter, but there's no central location. It's just an interesting time.
Mike, you hit on something really important. I think that the term news, just like the term reality show, right? Reality show now, under the category is everything from, Cops, which is sort of like a documentary, to
American
Dancing
Idol,
with the Stars, right? So it's almost a meaningless term.
Let me interrupt you, though. I live in Potomac, Maryland, and there's a TV show on Bravo, The Real Housewives of Potomac. Okay, I always tell my students, they're not real, they're not housewives, and they're not from Potomac, because I live there.
Other than
They've never had the cameras there, but anyway.
But other than that, it's a great
it's
show.
real, yeah.
But
Yeah,
so in much the same way, what cable news figured out, and think about this the next time you watch, and it really was a few years ago that figured out that they could report on the news, and yes, they love stories where they can speculate. There's a hostage taking, they got no pictures, there's a terrorist incident, they don't know what happened, so they bring on, a whole cottage industry of former FBI agents and hostage negotiators to talk about it. But what they love, and it's been reported on, at CNN and the others, they had an aha moment, and it's rather tragic, when that Malaysian airliner disappeared. They realized their ratings were true. They would do nothing but talk about it. There's all sorts of news going on. They focused on that. What cable news, okay, and I think we should call it primetime cable news, which are these long, running talk shows. They love unsolved mysteries or long-running soap operas, and that's really what they are, right? That with that Malaysian airline. What happened? They're going to bring people on. They got this. They got this. Somebody found a scrap of paper in the ocean. They're going to spend an hour talking about what that could mean with experts, and that's because of, frankly, ratings, right? Because what CNN discovered, when there isn't breaking news, right? People don't watch CNN. People don't watch MSNBC when there isn't breaking news. So they're loving the impeachment, and Donald Trump is right in one sense. The ratings have never been better since he became president. Fox News and MSNBC right behind it, and CNN right behind them, are having their best years ever in these ongoing conflict and soap operas. So much of it has to do with ratings.
Listen, tell me, I worked in local TV and cable, and I also briefly worked at NBC News. This is not telling a tale out of school, but the ratings were in the dumper. It was MSNBC before this current incarnation, and I don't take this the wrong way, but a plane went down and a cheer went up in the newsroom because they knew that the ratings were going to go up. And it's newsroom, more than newsroom humor, I'm
that's-
sorry to say.
We could do a whole session on that.
Yeah, that's a different book. But the ratings were everything, and people forget that. The reason they do these things is because they sell, which is, I guess life in the big city. The interesting thing about newspapers is that newspapers, I'm going back to the newspaper thing, I'm sorry about that, but the reason that newspapers were able to succeed is that they could put all this content in there, but they were selling ads, and the advertisers really didn't care because you had your Macy's ad or whatever it was, or the supermarket, local supermarkets and stuff like that, and the same with local TV, which, by the way, local TV is generally thriving and doing well, whether you like it or not, or whether it's doing a good job is a different issue, but in terms of the business of local TV, they seem to be doing well.
Okay. When viewers tune in to television news these days, are they looking to find out the facts and what's going on, or are they more looking for a cheerleader for their point of view?
I think that it depends what show, and it depends on the viewer and what show and what platform. If you watch the PBS NewsHour or Frontline, you're not looking for a cheerleader. If you're watching the evening news, you're probably not watching a cheerleader. If you're watching Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow, you are looking for a cheerleader. And in 2008, I went to it was in the beginning of this kind of new age, a very interesting panel that I listened to, and it was the New Yorker writer Ken Aletta, who's a very good media writer, and he was interviewing Bob Kerrey, who had become president of the New School, but obviously former presidential candidate. And he said something that still resonates with me today. He said, asking a similar question, what's different about this election cycle? And he said, for the first time, and this was 2008, he said, you can wake up in the morning, and if you're left of center, you can go to the Huffington Post and then watch MSNBC at night. And if you're right of center, you can read the Drudge Report or Breitbart and watch Fox News, and never run into an idea you disagree with. He said, and so news has gone from, here's what we all need to know, and gee, this is an interesting article or an interesting point of view that I hadn't thought of, to a series of affinity groups. And I think it's part of this tribalism that we all talk about. And news, there are people who say news is the way news is set up is the cause of that, and there are people who say, well, no, news is the result of that. And we can't probably arbitrate that tonight, but it's certainly a fact.
And it's probably a variety of factors. But I don't know if some of the professors I was sitting with are historians in their field. But wasn't this the case around the turn of the 20th century, right, the 1800s into the early 1900s, when there were multiple newspapers or multiple broadsheets or whatever, and they had multiple points of view, so that you had your...
Yeah, like the Journal American.
Yeah, it was a liberal one, and I remember I read the history of the Washington Post, and in the 1870s, they didn't like Rutherford B. Hayes, and so they never mentioned his name, in the paper, And I'm like, that's odd, and we survived that. This is different in some ways because of the immediacy and whatnot, but I think we are just lucky that we lived through a time when there was an agreement that this Walter Cronkite or this was factual, that we generally agreed. But I will tell you, in the 80s and 90s, in the 90s, we did surveys I was at A&E Network, which was different then. It was sort of like PBS-ish. And we did these surveys and find out, well, people wanted longer form news. And so we hired a guy named Bill Curtis, who's a famous ex-CBS anchor. And he did long form. And we did these focus groups and surveys. And people said, even then, they were like, I don't really like the news anymore, but I like Bill Curtis because he's giving it to you straight. And, he's given detail, and we trust him more, for some reason, more than we trust the news. And I think maybe there's just been this undercurrent for a while, and that the networks now, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, are now kind of exploiting that and realizing they can make a lot of money off of it. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes,
yeah.
Perfectly. What are the challenges, the major challenges that television news faces today?
The challenge?
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is the tyranny of ratings, which we just talked about a little bit, and the the public. There are a lot of times when the ratings are confluent with what is the best with the public interest. 9/11 being the biggest example. Like, nobody's going to say don't cover 9/11. It was the seminal event of our time. And I think the news divisions rose to the occasion, that. But can we say for sure that we are not, that we are, they're feeding us what we want and not what we need? And I'm not trying to say we need to be elitist about it, because I believe in the ratings and I believe in that. But isn't it your job to make things as interesting as possible? And so that is my existential fear, that we're not going to get into what the journalism department works so hard with their students to get them to really appreciate truth and facts and do that. And so I worry about that.
My worry is slightly different. Is that the people sitting, I'm just going rough demographics here, but the people sitting in the first 4 or 5, 6 rows here, okay, they're not the people I'm worried about. Okay, I'm worried about the people sitting in the back of the room who do not have a history of seeking out fact-based journalism. They expect it, and you guys, I'm not saying like scolding you, but you are, you are on Twitter, and you pick your news sources to come to you on Twitter. You expect Netflix to tell you, and you've come to expect Netflix, it's not like you demand it, to tell you, recommended for me. Okay, what's the next show up? That's what I'm going to watch. Okay, there's not an electronic program guide anymore like we have with cable, right? It's, here's what's coming up next, you watch it. Okay, here's what my Instagram influencers tell me is the hottest fashion. And so there's a lack of going out and seeking stuff. Now, there's a lack of going out and seeking stuff, what does that create the appetite for fact-based journalism? That, gee, this thing happened, how do I go find out and do more of it? And so, this dovetails to Mike's point about newspapers. People don't tend to realize that the way you go, oh, I'll just Google it. Well, you Google it, and what usually comes up? A report from a decent newspaper, right? And now the only people who seem to be able to make money or have robust newspapers are rich people, right? Bezos and the Sulzberger family and nonprofits. Newspapers are becoming nonprofit. So they often are the source of journalism. And Mike, I think when Mike and I both looked in local news, right? First thing we did in the morning, you looked at the Philadelphia Inquirer in TV news, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, and the Bulletin, and say, okay, well, let's follow up on that story. At networks, it's the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So I'm concerned that there isn't that somehow the appetite for news is among a next generation, among millennials and Gen Z, is dropping off. And that's my concern, that they are not creating the demand for fact-based news.
Which would create an advertising base to actually do it, which is the biggest issue.
Okay. How does the audience and the ratings compare today to back in the 60s and 70s?
That's fun. I didn't bring the data.
Yeah, I have that.
I had a conversation, this is my name-dropping time, with George Will about this, who's a pretty smart guy. And, he was asking me the same question, and Fox News does very well in the millions, and MSNBC does pretty good, and CNN does fairly well, too. But there's still slivers of the audience, and I'm sorry I don't have figures here. But Ed made a great point a little while ago. If you aggregate the 3 network newscasts, I don't know when they run here, 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and the NBC, CBS, and ABC, there's still, that's a ton of people. That's more, I know that would be more than the average MSNBC, the average Fox, or the average CNN, and probably more than all of them combined. And so the ratings pie in general is slicing and dicing and slicing and dicing. And now there are offshoots for all the networks. There are different newsy type networks that are coming on board. And in general, everything is smaller. The audiences are smaller and smaller.
There are some news organizations that I think, to your point, Bill, the measurement is a little bit different. There are some news organizations have said, CNN, NPR, Sam Zeff, you're here, right? Their view is probably the same thing. NPR, the BBC, their attitude is, we don't care on what platform you get your news as long as you get it from us. So no, there may not be as many viewers watching CBS News, but CBSNews.com is doing well. They stream stuff well. You can get it on your phone. You follow your Twitter feed. They sell that to advertisers. They sell those engagements. Now,
they're not doing that well on the, I mean, generally speaking,
right.
The digital dollars are,
they don't make as much yet.
It's digital dimes versus, but you're right, they're out there.
So they're out there, but the attitude is, or at least the evolution of what the New York Times feels the same way. That, you know, New York Times is making videos, and you can see that. And they have a podcast. So the idea is, we don't care where you get your news. We don't care how you get your news, as long as you get it from us. And I think that's what's evolving with the digital and social platforms.
Yeah, it's funny. I heard something on NPR the other day, and it was Scott Simon or one of the shows, and he said, you can see it on our website. You know, you could go to NPR, which is radio, and you could go and see. It was, you know, it was a story that had a visual angle to it, and so you can go see it. And I'm like, oh my God, it's finally happened, where everything's all one, you know, or it's heading that way, you know, because everybody's got a phone and everybody's got a camera, and it's over. You know, I work in documentaries now, and luckily, the long form is thriving because of places like Netflix and Hulu, and they're looking for that. But basically, anybody with a little phone can make a documentary, and probably some good ones.
That's what you say. You know, the good news is anybody can make a documentary. The bad news is anybody can make a documentary.
Right, that's right.
According to Gallup, public trust in mass media was at 72% in 1976, and it's 45% now.
Surprised it's that high.
Yeah,
really.
How does that figure into television news and affect television news decision makers?
Good question.
Good question. I'll take a crack at it. Part of that, obviously, is this polarization and this polarization of the news, right? If you're to the left of center and you watch Fox News and say, like, well, I don't trust these guys, they're terrible. If you turn on MSNBC and you're to the right, you're going, this is, and in fact, I think New York Magazine did a thing where they watched a night of Fox and MSNBC side by side, and they said it was like two different universes. They literally didn't cover the same stories. So that erodes public trust. And without being partisan here, I think that when the media is constantly attacked as fake news or enemies of the people, that certainly has an impact, I think, on public opinion. But I think it gets back to your earlier point and Mike's earlier point. There is very little common, just like there's very little common ground in our public discourse, there's very little common ground on what we would agree the perfect newscast would be, right? So you seek out your own, you make your own newscast, and you don't trust the other guy. And that, I think, is probably to our detriment. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think the screaming turns a lot of people off, ultimately. You know, the mature people that answer the surveys, you know, they're like, news media, they're not doing anything for me, they're just screaming. You know, and maybe they're screaming in the way that I want, but somewhere along the line, they're uncomfortable. I also think that there's been a strain in America that never ever really trusted. You know, they might trust Walter Cronkite, but ultimately, you know, it's those New York liberals that are controlling things. And I don't know. I think there's there's maybe below the surface it was bubbling, and finally it's finally come to the surface. But I don't think the networks help themselves by having shout fests. And stuff that isn't going anywhere. It can't be helpful to our dialogue. I think it's great. I've produced shows like that, talk shows and stuff, but it's like everything. You know, there's too much of it. It's fine, but it's just too much.
There's also a slippery slope, I think, that it gets, and in self-reflection, right? So you have MSNBC, which is kind of an opinion network, as an example, right? And you have NBC News, which for the most part tries to do pretty straightforward news reporting. But then the NBC reporter goes on MSNBC and does her report, and they said, so Ed, what's your take on what's this? Or what's your sense of what's going on in the White House? No. Good reporters, it's not their sense. It's not what their take is. It's what, what do you think? It's when it goes from the reporting to the speculative, I think for a lot of people that crosses a line. It crosses, and those reporters, you can almost see some of their anguish in being asked to, because they've been trained in being accurate, and I think that's different. You would never imagine Walter Cronkite saying to, they wouldn't be alive two-way with, Bruce Morton in Vietnam, and saying, Bruce, what's your take on what happened today? Yeah. It just wouldn't happen.
Yeah. Okay. I have one final question. I mean, I could sit here and ask these questions all night, but I have one final question, then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. But we have quite a few young people here. I'm asking, do we have a bunch of journalism majors here? Raise your hand.
Oh, very good.
Well, we got a few, but we have a lot of young students, students who are not journalism. But what advice would you give young people on two subjects? One is how to, kind of go through all the sources. You guys have really outlined the tremendous volume of sources and information available. How would you suggest to them that they go about, consuming news? And then secondly, if they are interested in a career in television news, what would you say to them?
You go for, we both teach, but you're more, you teach better students than I do. No, just kidding.
No. I would say, and even seeing, it's the same advice I gave to them in my I just finished my semester with them last week because it was a short course, and I did say to them, it kind of builds a little bit on what we were talking about. Seek out things that you wouldn't normally watch or see. As television programming executive, right? I was working in a cable company. You think I watch Jersey Shore? No. And do you think I would watch Floribama Shore for the people who think that Jersey Shore was too intellectual? But it makes it look like PBS. But what I said is, wait a minute, this is popular. This is somewhat of a cultural phenomenon. People are talking about it. I should watch it to try to, not to make fun of it, but to try to understand why it's successful. So in much the same way, okay, even if you completely disagree with the, I'm making this up with just to say the Republican view of the impeachment in the Ukraine, you know what? Read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. Understand what other people are saying about it. You don't have to agree with something to learn about it. And I think that is, to me, that is the great, develop a curiosity about why things are the way they are. What's behind it? What's the behind the scenes story? That's really what good journalism is. And the second piece is, so that, the second part is to get a job. Number one, don't go in with big expectations. Go with great dreams, but not expectations. And writing. No one who has learned to write well, when you're journalism, don't sit and do a stream of consciousness report, the qualities of good, clear, concise writing on deadline that I learned at a newspaper transferred with me to everything I did, including being an executive, and I had an hour to do a PowerPoint to explain some complicated thing we were trying to do. The ability to think and write clearly is a skill that will serve you no matter what you do.
Yeah, it's so true. It really is. I learned that my best writing was at 5 minutes before 6 o'clock when I had the news. It's amazing what you can do. The other thing is that good writing covers a multitude of sins, because if you can write well, it'll help you in all your other courses as well. The thing I would say that both in terms of current studies and getting a job is that this point in your life as a student, this will be the only time in your life that you get to think about things like ethics, like what's the right thing to do, the bigger picture. Because once you're in the business, no matter what angle it is, whether you're working for BuzzFeed or the New York Times, you're thrown in there and you just have to do it. If you don't have a sense of right and wrong and where you want to go, and even if, unfortunately, you're going to have to do some things that you go, ooh, I don't really like them, but at least that you know that they're not right. You need to, this is the only time in your life. Now, you may, you think, no, I really want to get to the edit room so I can edit my piece. I'm like, well, yeah, you do that for the rest of your life. What you need to do is figure out what is it that you're going to do that is going to advance that particular story or that particular issue that you're working on. And this, you have time to think now. And once you get in the world, we used to joke in our newsroom, our motto was another good story killed by over-checking. It was a joke. But you don't have time, or sometimes you don't, and it's like when you get to real life, you go, geez, if I don't have that standard. I was taught by, in graduate school by a guy, Ed Bliss, who he wrote for Walter Cronkite, and he was older, and he wrote for Edward R. Murrow.
Yeah.
And so he was the king of writing, in terms of good writing, and good writing isn't just good writing; it's good thinking, because sometimes it's not the actual writing; it's the putting together what's really important, and good storytelling. And good storytelling will make for a good report and will make the world a better place. And I live with documentaries now and working on big documentaries, and the ones that have the best stories are the ones that usually take you to a place that you haven't been and make you, to go on a journey. So. And I worked at National Geographic, which literally you're going on journeys, for these documentaries. And so there are places where you can ply your craft, but more important is you have to know what's right and wrong. I really believe that.
A great quote to summarize to summarize one of the points that Mike made. I also, I mentioned that I had gotten to work with Fred Friendly, and he exhorted the students, same thing, that this is your opportunity to really, he says, to develop the belief of what's right and wrong, because there's so many ways in this. Look at this. Look at where journalists are in the pantheon now of trust. And he said, there's going to come a time in your career when you're all alone in that editing room or at that typewriter, now terminal, and you're writing. And he'd say, I'll fake this shot, or I'll use a different soundbite, or, I'll fudge this fact. And who'd know? And he would stop, and he had this big thunderous voice. And he said, when that happens, you stop and go, I'd know. That's who'd know. And in other words, that's who'd know. It's a matter of conscience and a matter of commitment. So I think that's
I agree with you.
very important.
Totally agree.
Okay, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I especially want to get some questions from our young people who are mostly in the back of the room. But if you have a question, please raise your hand. And Alex and Olivia have cordless mics, and they will find you, and you can ask your question. Don't everybody ask at once. Okay, we got one right here.
Hi, I'm newspapers and news people like to use polls and polling. How can you possibly get accurate results on a poll when so many enlightened people don't answer their phones if they don't know who's calling.
It's a big issue. It's a big issue right now because it's tough to get accurate polls, and the last presidential election, I mean, proved it. It was, the polls were wrong, and the pollsters, and I'm not an expert on this, but they are looking for ways to get to people both by phone or online, or or having a bigger sample size. They're looking for ways to correct that for one reason. The candidates, in the case of politics, but also whoever else uses this, whether it's advertisers, they want accurate information, and so they're looking for new ways. I don't know what those ways are, but I've been every once in a while I read an article. They're trying some new device to, either to go online or to find cell phones, because cell phones are not listed. I don't know, but they're looking for ways. It's a huge issue right now. I wish I had an answer.
Yeah, I don't have
but
an
I
answer.
totally. If the pollsters were here, they would they could expound on how difficult it is these days because of that. And young people don't answer polls. So.
Or answer phones. We don't answer, right, between robocalls and nobody having landlines. Who actually answers their phone when you don't recognize the number? So it's it's definitely an issue for pollsters, and they got so burned in the 2016 election with their polling that now it's they're hoping to never get fooled again. We'll see what happens.
Okay, any other questions? Now, okay. I see 3 hands over here. So,
how does the death of local newspapers affect local politics in the way that sometimes in some cities or counties, local news stations are all that's left reporting on what the mayor does or what the city commissioner decides on?
great question.
I am
Great
like
question.
religious about that. If I were doing a master's thesis or a doctorate, I would try to do the research, because there, as good as local TV and radio is, they're not going to be as comprehensive as even the most middling newspaper. The only ray of hope is NPR, where stations are they're actually growing in terms of their news audience and their news, and I guess Sam would know better. But the stations are building news departments that do cover these things and do cover local news. But the death of newspapers, I think it's serious because you don't have it, which is bad enough. But the truth is, and Ed knows this, is that the local TV stations depended on the newspapers to
Set the agenda,
to do their to steer them. I mean, it was when I got in the business, I was like, wow, you mean you literally steal it from the newspaper? But yes, the answer is yes. Or if it was in if it was in the New York Times, then it was okay to cover it. If it was in the local paper, it was okay to cover it. And you're like, well, I knew that story 5 days ago, but it wasn't good enough to cover. The newspapers carried. Now they weren't always good, and there were a lot of problems, and they had biases themselves, and sometimes it wasn't accurate. But they had detail, and we don't have that detail, and that's really important.
They don't provide accountability anymore, right? You didn't. If you think about it, there's this big expression now, right? That places that don't have fresh food or food stores are called food deserts or areas of cities. Well, there are news deserts, right? Newspaper closes. Long ago, the local station is owned by, has no news, is running all syndicated programming. They don't have reporters, the local radio station. Maybe if they're lucky, there's an NPR station nearby. The TV station in some, maybe in the nearest big city, maybe if there's a 7-car pileup, they'll send a reporter to that town or a murder. But the general political coverage, the taxes, the schools, the issues of income inequality or other political flashpoints literally don't get covered anymore. And therefore, when you talk about accountability and transparency in government, who's watching the store now?
I was the king of political debates in Philadelphia, and I put together debates from in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. That's right. And on our station, luckily, the station devoted a lot of airtime to local issues and stuff. I don't think that station does that anymore.
No.
Most stations don't really do that. I covered the legislature when I was in Delaware and covered, and the state legislatures, it's a hotbed of unbelievable stories, both good and bad, and it doesn't get covered. I mean, it's just like you can't believe what goes on there. It's fascinating. I mean, both in a good way and sometimes a bad way, but I'm like, we're missing all this great stuff. It's a shame.
Okay, I think we have a question right over here.
Hi there. Okay, so do you
Sir,
see
sir, would you stand up,
Yeah,
please?
stand
So
up.
everybody can see who's asking the question.
So you kind of talked a little bit about those like ethical dilemmas, and as a young reporter, I feel that there's a sort of disconnect between being taught this ethical journalism and also kind of arriving in a world where like ratings are king. Is there any sort of like ethical dilemma that maybe you faced in that sort of regard as like an example?
Oh boy, yeah, all the time. I started work at a public TV station, and so, you know, they were less concerned about ratings. And then I went to work for a station that has like the highest ratings in the free world, and it's a terrific station. They did all this other programming too, but the boss sat me down, and I'm really young, and I'm like, well, you know, I got my graduate degree and I worked at public TV, and he says, well, just don't forget one thing. I said, oh, what's that? He says, this is a business. I said, what? No, it's a business. We're here to make money. I was like, well, that's it? No journalism, no Woodward Bernstein, no break this big story. Yeah, oh, sure, yeah, we do that too. But we're here to make money, and that's and now within that structure, that I had a choice. You know, I could stay. What am I going to do? Quit at age 22? You know, and make us. It's not the statement's not. You know, but can you do a good job within that setting? And the answer is yes. I could do a really good job. You know, I did. I was real proud of the work that I did, and as I said, I did political debates and, you know, award-winning news pieces and magazine things, and it was a sobering moment. And if you're asking, was there a specific story, I'm trying to think. I'm sure there was something specific, like where I had to. I'll have to think about that because it's probably embarrassing, and I've tried to erase it from my mind.
I was lucky again. We always knew it was a business and everything else. I always was lucky that I think I worked for people who sort of felt the same way. And yes, while they'd be a little more tabloidy and, you know, those teases on the local news, you know, coming up, your sweatshirt could kill you, you know, there was coming up your sweatshirt, that you know, but the basic, that was sort of the promotion around it. The actual, there really was a sense that you had to get it right. Now, interestingly, much later in my career, I was an executive at a network. Some of you may remember, it doesn't exist anymore, Court TV. And it was becoming, and I was sort of the architect of their sort of documentary true crime programming, which is all sort of fact-based and journalistic and produced for us by NBC News and CBS News and other producers. And the network was purchased by Time Warner, and they were decided they're going to turn it into a reality show network, True TV. And I remember I sat in a development meeting with the new boss, and they showed a clip. This is going to be our new series. And it looked like a documentary thing, and I realized, no, wait a minute, this can't be real, because it was about repo men repossessing cars, and you would never be allowed on public property, on private property, if this were a real show. It was obviously staged. So I said, and everybody's sitting around, go, oh, isn't this great? And I said, wait a minute, this isn't real, it's fake. And the head of the network, the relatively new head of the network, said, this is it. He said, you're not at ABC News anymore, pal, is what he said in that meeting. And I decided to leave 3 months later, because I just basically said, and you know, I can't, this is not who I am. And one of the great, another great quote somebody said that I wish I thought of, said, go to work, as a journalist, you have to go to work every day prepared to quit. Isn't that great? It's sort of true, right? So I always remember that.
Yeah.
Okay, I saw a hand back here. Do we have one back here? And then we have one right here.
Kind of a revolution has occurred in late night TV. We had some comedians becoming news commentators, such as Tavis Smiley and Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart. And then we had some longtime serious commentators' careers wiped out within 48 hours under the Me Too situation, such as
Tavis
Smiley and Charlie Rose and
Bill O'Reilly.
Garrison Keillor even.
Yeah.
And then suddenly Amanpour and company came on, and they seem to be doing a very good job with world news. What's your quote take on late night right now?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, the comedy world, which or the comedy news world, which I honestly I don't know how that became such a lucrative franchise that you have 5, 6, 7 different people doing jokes about today, but jokes about the news.
I think there's a younger generation that is interested in learning in that way, and I think the Comedy Central, if you think about Colbert's original show, how many shows did do interviews with actual authors, right? He would have book authors come on, and Jon Stewart. So in many ways, it was an alternate way of getting news. I went to an event, a awards thing, in which Jon Stewart was getting an award, and Brian Williams was introducing him. And Brian Williams, of course, thinks of himself being very funny, went into the whole thing. Jon Stewart gets up and says, "Isn't this a crazy world we live in?" Yeah. He says, a guy who, he's talking about Brian Williams, he says, a guy who's supposed to deliver the news thinks he's a comedian, and a guy who's a comedian is taken seriously about delivering the news. But I think that, again, there's an appetite for people to somehow, it's this affinity group thing, right? It's an outlet for people to sort of vent and to they don't understand what's going on in the world, and some of it's very, very creative.
And it's a source of news in a weird way, or a source of information, just delivered in a different way. The comedian's role these days is pretty interesting, because they're, in general, not just late night, but I think in general, they're delivering, maybe it's always been this way, but they're delivering, they're giving you information that you might want to know. I just don't think it's an accident. It's a good question, though.
Okay, I think we had a hand right here.
Thank you. Maybe I shouldn't ask this question, but I'm a newsaholic. Which programs do you watch at night? Which ones do you watch? PBS and? No. I mean, I watch NBC because in my market it comes on at just the right time. Nightly news, because I like facts. I'm like, the old school. I read several newspapers, and it's funny. The morning shows drive me crazy. I can't do it because it's just too much in the kitchen or whatever. And I had a proposal once at National Geographic to do like an NPR style morning show, because the morning shows, the Today Show, other than the first half hour, I can't stand. They're fine people. They know some of them, but it's not news. So anyway, I watch NBC Nightly News. I watch the late local news. I watch CNN a lot. And like Ed's thing, I always try to sample whatever else is going on. Like especially if I hadn't seen Colbert or Samantha Bee, I didn't really know that thing. But I'll try to. But I'm not a regular consumer. But I'm from professional, just from an information standpoint. I watch the Brian Williams show, the one that comes on late, because I like his panel.
Similarly,
I was on Bill O'Reilly, by the way. I was interviewed by Bill O'Reilly and survived.
But did you get to say anything?
Barely.
You weren't interrupted constantly.
No, I had to interrupt him. That was in order to say something.
I think, you know, I think for me, very similarly, I'm old school enough to want to watch the evening news at 6:30. I also try to watch sometimes watch the PBS NewsHour because PBS is one of my clients for my consulting business, so I always like to sort of check in with what they're. I also watch BBC World News, the channel, because it's fascinating some days. You know, we're so focused on domestic news and inside the Beltway. You watch that, and, you know, there are 100 stories you should know about, and they do such a great job of covering that. I do sample the cable shout fests in the evening again to see what they're talking about. Sometimes if Frontline is, you know, is doing something interesting. And again, I try, I kind of think of it as my tasting menu, right? There are the things I watch all the time, and then things I like to try to see on. And the thing about Brian Williams, for those of us here interested in journalism, what I do, you know, he's kind of I shouldn't say this, we're recording this. He can be in love with the sound of his own voice sometimes, but at the same time, that program brings on usually the people who are the journalists, the print journalists, who are writing the big stories of the day, the Washington bureau chiefs of USA Today, Washington Post, New York Times, Politico. And they're interesting, so they also give interesting perspective on not just what they reported on, but sort of the stuff I love, which is the how I got that story.
Well, he has historians on, too. I think that's interesting a lot of times, because I like to say, well, what's the context? You know, has this happened before? Has it not happened before? You know.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. We have one right here. We have one up here, Alex. Oh, you got one back there? Okay. We'll get them all. Good.
Gentlemen, could you offer some observations, just from your range of experience, on how the changing or the altering of TV news has both affected and been affected by campaigns, political campaigns?
The horse race of a campaign, this is sort of basic 101 effect, but the horse race of a campaign is irresistible for TV news because it's like sports. But one of the great things that television does is sports. And it is like sports because you're eventually going to have a winner and a loser. And so and it's relatively easy, it's harder to cover an earthquake in, you know, Guatemala, but it's relatively easy to cover the candidates. And so to that extent, you get a lot of coverage of politics these days because they've discovered that it's interesting, it's important. I mean, look, you know, it's important to the nation. And there's a story. It's a natural story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so I think to me, that's how campaigns have affected the news, but there may be other bigger philosophical answers to that question.
I think that I think Mike is absolutely right about, you know, there's the mentality of the horse race, who's up, who's down, the winners, the losers, right? TV loves that, right? You know, I was appalled in that first debate. You know, Chuck Todd goes around and says, in 1 minute, tell me, you know, one sentence, what do you think? You know, lightning round, you know, that doesn't provide context or smart. It's just to generate, you know, viral sound bites and headlines. So I think that the campaign has affected television news, and obviously, and we have some veteran campaign people here in the audience, but obviously the people who run the campaigns, they adapt to TV news, right? They get their candidates on shows where they might pick up a different, all those town halls. One thing you can't argue on the good side is there's certainly more exposure now for candidates. And, you know, they used to get 30-second sound bites and their commercials. Now, you know, you get a 4-hour town hall. I don't know if anybody can sit through them about this and that. But boy, if you want to know more about what the candidates are talking about, there certainly are opportunities to do that. But the actual coverage is very much horse race, very much, as we talked about with cable news, looking for the soap opera. You know, will they, won't they? You know, the minor, you know, difference between, you know, if there's a Twitter feud, you know, they cover, you know, between Elizabeth Warren and, I don't know, Pete Buttigieg, it's covered with the same, you know, it's covered like it's between, you know, Kanye and Jay-Z. It's crazy, like a big entertainment spat. So I think the tabloidy nature has snuck into that, but I also think that, like in any ecosystem, they adapt to each other. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's interesting though, because it wasn't that long ago that politics was seen as kind of boring, and now the cable networks and everybody's kind of jumped on it and said, hey, this is not that boring after all. And I'm like, God, that's great. Let's try that to a bunch of other issues, and maybe we'll, because there's a million other things to do, and but at least they've done that. So.
Okay, we have a question back here, and I've got Olivia. I've got a question right here on the front row, and this will be my last question. We'll go back here right now.
Hi, you mentioned BBC a little bit, and I was just wondering how you feel about national broadcast news networks and their coverage of international issues. Do you think that it's insufficient, or how much do you think it's their job to cover more international topics?
Yeah, I mean, they can decide whether it's their job, but I would say that it is your job to cover what's going on in the world that's relevant to me or interesting to me. And it's, I would say, from a critic standpoint, minimal. Like there used to be bureaus, they'd have lots of bureaus around the world, and they'd cover and they'd file their stories, and you'd see that. I'm not saying it was perfect. And even CNN used to do, they do a lot more on the international, the channel, the CNN International. But it's pretty weak, which is why if you go to BBC, you go, oh, that's interesting. I had no idea, that there's a country called Cameroon or whatever. It's pretty weak. It's minimal. I mean, they send out one guy and call that international.
Or voice it over from London or something like that. The video fed in. But I think the other thing is, again, look at this ecosystem. I'm always coming up here for the helicopter view, which is that the world, the media environment, again, around the world, it's strange, a paradox, that the media is more global than ever before, but the audience is more hyper-local than ever before. Right? It used to be that Law and Order, and that's true in the entertainment side, right? Law and Order, right, was syndicated in 732 countries around the world, right? Whatever. But now there's a Law and Order France, there's a Law and Order UK. They bought the format and they make it in France or London. American Idol was a British show, and there are 17 versions of that. I just read that the show 24. Okay, India makes its own version of 24. Okay, they bought the form. Homeland was based on an Israeli series. So that happens. So the audience wants local, in their language, and all that stuff. And the U.S. audience is particularly I won't go far as say xenophobic or jingoist, but is centered within our border, and so. If you have 22 minutes in the evening news, the people in the foreign bureaus, and Scott Richardson and I used to sit and listen to them make their plea to the evening news to get a story on from here or there, and they'd say, no, there's a street festival in St. Louis, let's do that, it's more fun than some obscure story. So on one hand, people want that news, and you need that context when there's a terrorist attack in France and others. And so CNN tries to do a good job with that. The BBC is certainly a great place to go. But you're right, there probably isn't as much coverage, and not as much coverage that takes the time to explain, wait a minute, if there's a huge anti-Semitic attack in France, here's what it means for the rest of the world, and here's what it's connected to.
Okay, we're going to take one final question right here.
Thank you for coming. I find that I gather news by accident. I watch a lot of television. PBS, C-SPAN is really a good source, and it's Science Channel, the History Channel. Every once in a while, they come up with something that's, maybe from World War II, but it's brand new. No one's talked about it before. And so as I say, I just kind of search and hope I come up with something that's useful. One final point. There's a show out of the public network, TV network in Kansas City called KC Week in Review. And they have 4 panelists and 1 host, and they do a weekly show that is very good. You can find out what's going on in the Kansas City area, and they don't talk all over one another. They really do a good job.
Well, the fact that you're searching, I think, is like the message, is that it keeps searching. I was present at the creation of the History Channel and helped start it, and I think the gentleman asked earlier about ethical dilemmas, and I thought of this, and it relates to your thing about the History Channel. When they were starting it, we had these informal groups at work to start this new channel called the History Channel. And we all came up with different ideas how should you do the program. And there was one idea that somebody had, I won't mention who, and they said, well, let's have corporations do their own history. Let's have Coca-Cola do its own history and then air it on the History Channel, or let's have, you know, and right, and so there's like 5 or 6 of us, and somebody pitches, you know, says, no, I really want to do that. It's a great, we can make a lot of money, and you know, they could deliver the program, and we just air it, and that was like the only time I've actually been brave. I was like, well, I said that's kind of all you have is your integrity. You're the History Channel. If you don't have your if the History Channel doesn't have integrity, you don't have anything. You have nothing. You might as well be, you know, anybody. You could be be TBS or something, and so you know, and the interesting thing is they had done a lot of research, and and they said, well, I still think it's a good idea. A few weeks later, in the Wall Street Journal, got a hold of that story and said, History Channel considering giving time to corporations for, and I had nothing to do with the story. But they decided not to do it because it would have been embarrassing to do that. And the fact that you now go to the History Channel and can actually find something and feel that it's, you know, trustworthy is terrific. And I think the fact that you're searching is the message that Ed was saying to everybody is like, you know, look around, you know, look, you may stumble on something. I saw a thing on PBS the other day about the Reconstruction. It was a documentary about, you know, after the Civil War, but before the 20th century. And, you know, I knew very little about that. And I was like, again, I was stumbling around. I'm in the business, and I didn't know that this existed. And it's like, this is fascinating. And I think that's the great thing about having so much choice these days. And maybe that's my message is the positive thing, is that there is choice, and you can find the BBC. Used to be that you'd have to go to England or go to another country or go to shortwave radio to listen to the BBC. Now you can just, you know, call it up. So, and C-SPAN is a national treasure. C-SPAN is an amazing, amazing thing. It's fabulous.
So, but one thing it's important to note, though, one thing you said I think what you said has importance because it has a through line. What you're really looking, you weren't saying you're looking for more news McNuggets, as we like to call it. This happened, that happened, 6 dead, 4 thing, 2-second clip of a car wreck. All the things you mentioned, C-SPAN, History Channel, Science Channel, PBS, they try to provide context so that you have a deeper understanding when you get that text that says 6 dead in a car bomb. Well, you know what? I just saw a History Channel on the troubled history of Afghanistan, okay? Or the new breakthrough in cancer research. I just saw a thing on the Science Channel about, you know, about looking for superbugs and stuff like that. So I think that's really important through line, that there's the news McNuggets, but then we have to seek out, and that's still really, on a very positive note, that is still a role for great journalism, and great journalism is providing context so that we understand the world better, all these things that happen.
Gentlemen, thank you. Please join me in thanking him for a terrific discussion tonight. Thanks for coming out. Our next evening program will be December 11th. We'll be presenting the Dole Leadership Prize to Professor Temple Grandin, who is an expert in animal welfare and also in autism. and has an extraordinary career in life, and we're eager for that program. So I hope you can join us for that. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks. Great job.